So I believe I'm here because I've written some books, and a little bit like Anna Pearce said earlier, I may have written some books, but I don't read huge amounts of theory. And I could also add that I've written these books, but I wouldn't have known at the time why I was writing them. I had an opportunity to write a book, and I thought, well, hey, you know, something to do, I might as well write a book. And so in that way, like I grew up reading. I first, to explain my relationship with writing and reading, I learned to read and write so late in primary school that my parents were told I was mildly mentally handicapped, which isn't the right term these days, but that's what they were told. And so I grew up thinking that I wasn't good at writing, number one. And then during my teens I read a lot, and I read a lot of early 20th century novels, a lot of Vladimir Nabokov, a lot of kind of East European, German and Russian novels. And there's nothing for me like a storyline to drive me to read to the end. And with books of theory, I pick them up and I put them down and I pick them up, and it takes me a long time to read theory. So I found Baum, Wohnen, Denken, Bilden, Dwelling, Thinking by Heidegger when I was in 4th year in college. And it travels around with me, and I might have read all of it by now. Like I've had Heidegger for Architects, there's a blue book in my bag for the last 3 months. And I'm kind of, so I have things that travel with me, I think, for long periods of time that I do get something out of, but a lot of the time you might read it, and in fact you read novels from the same period, and you absorb the same stuff. So I wrote these books without a kind of a dense knowledge of architectural theory, and more as something that I felt was parallel to my practice as an architect. So this letter has been referred to quite a lot during the day. So and it's kind of dear to my heart. So I'll read it through quickly. So this was a letter that Peter Carroll, who was at the time the editor of Building Material, wrote to Shane de Blockham to ask him to write about education, and it's an edition about education. So he says, I have a real difficulty with writing about architecture. I'm not able to do it, and it takes forever. Also, I'm not sure that it matters what an architect says about his or another's work. When I was teaching in University College Dublin, I used to get the students to make big drawings and series scale models of buildings so that they would understand them, following the principle of what matters is the work and not words. It is more important to know the building and understand the meaning of the building in its physical presence. The most destructive influences in modern architecture, postmodernism and deconstruction, come from words about architecture and not from building. I am sorry I wouldn't be able to do what you ask. And he finishes off by making a comment about Louis Kahn, who said that very often a concept was intangible, but generally required an idea of well-being of the person or society, as well as a delight in construction. So there's a few interesting things about that letter. For me it's interesting because Shane de Blockham was head of 5th year when I was in 5th year in UCD. He was very much a force in the School of Architecture at the time. And when I went through architecture school, we didn't have to write. There was a few measly pages of a dissertation in 4th year, but really, at the time, I wasn't good at writing. I didn't write very much, and I didn't have to write as part of my architectural studies. And Shane obviously is talking about that in this letter. That's one thing. Another thing is that the element of sleight of hand. Shane de Blockham does write about architecture. He wrote that, and that was, even though he's saying I don't want to write about architecture, he's writing something in a way, it's in the form of a letter, but he knows bloody well that this is going to get published. So he's writing something to be published that are his thoughts about architecture. So it's important to remember sometimes length isn't important. This is very profound, it's important, and for me I think it's important because it has authority, and the authority that it has is gained from the fact that Shane de Blockham is an extremely successful practitioner. He's one of really the greats of the last 20, years of Irish architecture, I'd say. So that gives them authority to talk about architectural practice. The authority comes from the things that he's constructed. So I kind of had these questions for myself. What is the function of architectural writing? Why does the architect write? What role does writing have in the design of buildings? And this, I suppose, talks itself around these questions. And the relationship between writing and architecture I find extremely troubling, so I don't come to any conclusions in this at all, but it's just a series of thoughts. So one element to this is the pressures of academia. And in an academic world, the production of research has become essential, and normally that research is presented as a piece of writing in a peer-reviewed journal. So what you have to understand as students is your teachers are under pressure to publish research, yet strangely puts them under no pressure in the School of Architecture to design buildings. Architectural journals are not peer-reviewed in an academic sense, whereas architectural academic journals are pretty obscure and I would reckon are hardly ever read by practitioners. So we have to always question in terms of research, and I know I'm mixing up research and writing here together, but most research is published as writing. So who or what does this research serve? So as an aside, I would say that architects in my vision would be researching through the making of real buildings or speculative designs and propositions. And the writing is a secondary pursuit, and it is useful in education and sometimes useful to express ideas that can't be expressed through building. And perhaps then as a kind of reflective act of journaling, as Shannon would have described it, it's sometimes interesting as a way of looking back at what you've done. So, I don't know, is that the relation between theory and practice is obviously crucial to the pursuit of anything really, and theory is often expressed through words and practice through making things. Certainly in art or architecture, practice is understood as being a making things. So in the art world at the moment, in the contemporary art scene, the relationship between theory and practice is quite fraught, and it's often unclear whether the essay in the catalogue that frames the piece of theory that the artist is working from is often more important than the piece of work itself. And this would be understood and part of culture. And in art, art doesn't necessarily need a physical embodiment. So Liam Gillick had a show a few years ago in Curlin, and the administrator was worrying that half the show hadn't arrived, and the half of the show hadn't arrived because it wasn't there, it was just an idea and had no physical embodiment. So the art world is very comfortable with that, and as somebody myself who likes objects, it disappoints me often when I'm looking at art these days, but the art world is comfortable with that. And the culture of architecture and the culture of writing about architecture is very allied to writing about the art world, and there's quite a lot of art critics write about architecture and vice versa, so that the two worlds intermingle. And here we have the kind of dense rubbish that is often written about art. You can see this, the artist challenges the viewer to explore the rules encoded in the subconscious that shapes our aesthetics, to consider why we find beauty in the juxtaposition of chaos and order. And you know that that guy has read that in the catalogue, and he's using it as cultural capital to seem attracted to the woman that he's talking to in the gallery. So that he's using words as cultural capital, and that are really quite divorced from the picture that they're looking at, and possibly doesn't even help understand, or certainly doesn't help enjoy the picture that they're looking at. So that's Peter Eisenman's, and I've written up there, hey, you're going to have to read about me before you use me because I'm very conceptual. I'm actually based on complex literary theory. And I think this is what happens then when theory starts being abused in the world of architecture, in the way that it often is, and in the way that Shane de Blocker was talking about. And certainly Eisenman theorising in the way that he did would have been very, in the forefront of Shane's mind when he wrote what he wrote. And I suppose the important difference is that art is viewed in often controlled situations where there is access to a mediating device, whether that's a catalogue or even an artist's talk or something like that. And it's stating the obvious, and excuse me for kind of stating simple, obvious facts, while architects are able to write and architects are able to talk, buildings aren't. So buildings cannot do this. Buildings are dumb, silent things, and the way that we experience them is quite visceral. It's a lot to do with kind of just being somewhere and feeling something from that place. And I suppose that brings up with me then, if I start reflecting on how I do use words and what words have, what part they play in me designing buildings, I can safely say that I think it's very important not to talk too much about sometimes, certainly for me, and everybody's different, but I can't talk very much about what I'm designing at the time because I don't really know what it is. And this is something that, this is Freud and Jung, and Jung obviously on the right, Freud on the left. And this is a quote that Aldo Rossi quotes in an analogical architecture. So what it was in letters that Freud and Jung wrote to one another. So I've explained that logical thought is what is expressed in words, directed to the outside world in the form of discourse. Analogical thought is sensed yet unreal, imagined yet silent. It is not a discourse, but rather a mediation on themes of the past, an interior monologue. Logical thought is thinking in words, analogical thought is archaic and unexpressed. And when I found my way to that, that describes closely to me the way that I'm thinking when I'm designing something. And the drawing is this kind of fleeting or unexact thing that you make from a kind of a fleeting thought that you half know what it is, and then you draw it and it kind of looks rotten, and then you draw it again and it gets better. And that process is a process that is, I think, personally for me, intrinsically not to do with words, because words start defining things in a way that are quite straightforward and quite simple, and not in a way that architecture is actually complex in its creation. So that's me talking about how I think one thing is it's clear that I write, because I publish things in books, and so writing is a part of my practice. I don't think it's part of my practices of designing buildings, and at any time I might be writing things that look forward to a way of designing that I can't manage because of the constraints of technology or the constraints of society or whatever. So there's that type of writing that is able to be much more forward-thinking than my actually making of things. And then there's other writing that's looking back and it's reflective, and you know, these things that you make that are buildings, you look back on them 2 or 3 years, and then you get an inkling of what they're about. And you know, or somebody says to you, no, that's really, you know, your work is all to do with lines, and you kind of go, who, what, or whatever, and then you think about it, and it means something to you. So writing for me happens before the event, and it happens after the event. But the actual event of making architecture, that's not coexistent with that. So I'm one kind of person. We saw Shannon Chance's drawings earlier with all these neat writing all the way down it, and I'm like, whoa, you know, I couldn't do that. But she can obviously do that. But I think back to Shane, you know, what matters is the works and not the words. So education is an exchange, okay? And you know, we do have to talk about things when we're in a situation of exchange. And I mostly have spent my working career working on my own, sitting in a room on my own. And for a year, Brian Ward worked with me, about a year was it? Yeah. And for the first time for ages I had to try and talk about stuff while we were doing it, because you have to have a conversation and exchange with the other person in the room, which I found interesting, challenging, and not entirely comfortable. You know, I enjoyed working with Brian, and he brought a lot to things, but I realised the extent to which I don't really like to verbalise what I'm at. But verbalising is necessary in education, and certainly, you know, we all have to talk about things here in order to advance them. So this is one person who's kind of interesting to me with regards to theory and practice. It's Paulo Freire, and not just the practice of growing beards and wearing glasses. So, pedagogy of freedom. Critical reflection on practice is a requirement of the relationship between theory and practice. Otherwise, theory becomes simply blah, 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 and practice pure activism. So that speaks of the relationship between ideas and things that is always there, but I would say very strongly it's there whether we're talking about it or not. And then the other person is Donald Schoen, who was mentioned by Shannon earlier, who'd be a very influential educational psychologist from the late 60s, early 70s, who embedded himself in schools of architecture in America, and looked at how architecture was taught as a kind of a problem-based learning device. And this would be a diagram of his, which is very much in the same scope as diagrams that Shannon was showing earlier. So we have, we can start anywhere, but observation and reflection, followed by forming abstract concepts, forming by testing in new situations. For the architect, I suppose that's making a design, concrete experience, seeing how that turns out, and then reflecting on that, and round we go again. So that's a kind of a constant creative process where you're making things, you're looking at them, you're wondering about them, possibly talking about them, and moving on again. So that's trying to row back a little bit and say why words are relevant within an educational environment. So that's the kind of, you know, that's what we do all the time. We sit around and we talk about what we do, but we do talk about what we do with pencils in our hands, making drawings, I think, as much as possible. So that's kind of, I suppose, writing for architecture. And then I made a series of just statements as to things that I suppose I believe coming out of the ideas that I've been talking about. So let's make words that serve the practice of architecture, that communicate clearly ideas about buildings, that can become buildings. Let's be wary of words that make what we do sound more complex than it is, that obstruct understanding while attempting to make us appear shallowly intelligent. And there's a lot of that goes on. We should always be judged by what we make, not what we write. What we write helps others to judge what we make. And then what we write just throws a little more light on why we do what we do. That is design buildings. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dominic. So now it's Andrew Clancy from Clancy Moore Architects and Queens.
Hi. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, as Brian was saying, I'm an architect in a small and young practice with Colin Moore, and we also jointly run the Masters of Architecture in Queen's University in Belfast. And this process of both teaching and practicing produces a kind of a reflective relationship for me. And out of that process, thoughts or questions or problems emerge for me in the nature of practice and in the nature of education. And on the basis of those problems, I made a submission to the Arts Council and was awarded what's called the Kevin Kieran Bursary, which is I suppose, to support what they call practice-based research. This talk that I'm giving you, I suppose, is kind of part of the thoughts that are evaporating out of that process at the moment. I'm writing a series of essays, some drawn, some modelled, some spoken, some written, and together they're acting to transform my practice. This one, Ground Found, deals with writing and architecture, and it's an essay. And in thinking about the word essay, I'm reminded of John Summerson's preface to his book Heavenly Mansions, where he writes, quote, "An essay is an attempt, and the 10 essays in this book are attempts to illuminate certain widely different aspects of architecture which have interested me. None of the essays is a formal or a final treatment of its subject, and in some I must confess to trespassing on ground for my passport, as historian and critic is not exactly valid. I offer no apology for this. Architecture, past, present and future, is indivisible, and a writer on the subject must pry as best he can equally into Gothic niches and the offices of practicing architects. Both have some bearing on the architectural thought of tomorrow." So in my case, I suppose that the health warning comes from this may not have any bearing on any of your thoughts, it has bearing on mine, and really its relevance is only profit as such. This drawing of the Gravestone Circle at Lochgur comes out of survey work I've been undertaking as part of this bursary. The circle, 45 metres in diameter, is marked by 113 stones placed about the perimeter. It was laid out by the placing of a central post, and the edge marked with a rope swept about this point. Other than several hearth spaces placed within, there are no other built structures. Its scale is impressive. The largest stone, Runach Crumdove, weighs over 40 tonnes, and 12 orthostats diametrically opposed break into a clear calendar. The whole structure is carefully aligned to the solstices. But for me, none of this is the most impressive aspect of the construction, because the entire ground defined by the circle, to a depth of some 60 centimetres, is imported soil, packed down, some 130 tonnes of material in all. Now, there's nothing particularly special about the soil physically. It comes most likely from somewhere reasonably close to the circle. So this is ordinary ground, somehow rarefied by the act of its transplantation. The archaeological record, so clear as to the physical constituency of the making and current state of the site, is not explicit as to function. The presence of large mounts of deliberately broken pottery and 2 hearths mean that it is classified under that broad and ultimately useless classification of ceremonial. Despite this, and in full awareness of my ignorance, I can speculate. The placing of this layer of soil is to me the most profoundly architectural act of the constellation. In it, there is a deliberation, used here as in thinking, about the nature of place. The soil would have been spread carefully, hollows filled and bumps smoothed. By its artificiality, it makes the silhouette of the stones more profound, more defined. There is an aesthetic at work here, one that understands that sometimes the best way to understand a place is to make some ground from which to regard it from. It is not projective, as a fortification, but rather it is receptive. The circle has a permeable boundary, admitting the surroundings to bear on those within. We know the circle was an observational device in the sense that, yes, it does allow for the tracking of the stars, the marking of the seasons, and perhaps of the landscape and its products beyond. But I don't believe that any of these were the principal thing being observed. Above all else, on the occasion of ritual and in the gathering of people together, it was a place for society to regard itself from itself. This act of self-reflection and consideration is an important part in the formation of consciousness, and one can argue that the proliferation of these circles represents a burgeoning but sophisticated societal self-awareness. In some of these structures, there is evidence that the stones were a significant part of the oral tradition, acting as guides to sections of remembered narrative to aid with their retelling, bookmarks of a sort. In this, the circle becomes loosely aligned with writing, as it is a place where those attuned to the meaning of symbols can use it to release specific information. The information is not embodied in the symbol, but in the mind of the person reading it. This is all speculation, mind you. An artifact outside the cultural situation that produced it cannot communicate the full weight of its import and use on its own. This circle, the place written into being, is mute beyond its evident qualities as a place of some power. In reflecting about the act of writing in my practice, this observation is a useful place to start. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm setting aside most writing pertaining to architecture and choosing to deal solely with that writing produced by practitioners. Not only that, I'm ignoring the majority of the writing a practitioner undertakes, the writing of the day-to-day correspondences, specifications, and other documentation so necessary to create a building. So I'm dealing solely with writing by practitioners about what they do, a subject that frankly I find myself slightly surprised to be addressing. For I am, and I remain, very sceptical about the value of writing as a projective device within architecture. Rather, it is the ability of writing that in the act of its creation acts as a critical mirror that attracts me. So I'm not sceptical about all writing per se, but I'm sceptical about its certainty and of writing as propaganda, as a projective force for a philosophy or a mask to the quality of the building. Perhaps in part this comes from my experience as a student, when I read voraciously in search of answers, of insights, of truths. In this, some of what Shannon was describing comes home to bear. Perhaps I'm slow, and perhaps this is being compressed into your education to a far shorter time, but I stayed in stage 1 of her diagram for most of my college career. Architecture has a rich history of practitioners writing precisely for this person, this inquisitive person. Our earliest treatises were really technical manuals, backed up by critical justification of the rules being set out. But this critical section, the theoretical, became a field of its own. The written word became an integral part of the education and of the development of architectural thought. For many, it was a means of projecting influence, of claiming ground within which to operate. By the time I was a student, this appeared to have overreached itself. Many firms seemed more interested in their publishing arm, while text had conquered in another sense. A whole movement was spun from the obsessive linguistic games of late 20th century French philosophy. And for those of you not acquainted with that field, I advise you to leave well alone. It left me with little of value to build on, but an aversion to overly complex language and an appreciation for clear thinking, and the effort it takes for clear thinking to be manifest in clear writing. To me, the most valuable writings are those offered up in a spirit of curiosity rather than certainty. These essays are invariably open-ended, at times contradictory, although somehow in the act of seeing someone grapple with the fundamentals of their sensibility, there exists a chance for a heightened awareness to oneself. This time also cemented my belief that the ultimate value of architecture is as experience. It is only through experience, I believe, that architecture can be comprehended. Comprehension, of course, is not the same as understanding. Comprehension is to seize, to grasp wholly with the mind. It comes from the same root as prehensile. Understanding, with its links to intelligibility, derives from the word legere, to read. So while the spatial experience can be comprehended directly and without foreknowledge, the cultural edifice which stands behind and around the built environment should exist to create this understanding and to build upon it. So in short, I suppose, in the field of architecture we seek to understand what it is we do so that the user, the person comprehending the space, can achieve, I suppose, a connection with something of meaning. I don't mean meaning in the literal sense, but actually of value to them as an individual in the world. So architecture is not quite the same as sciences, in that successive generations can act to advance the knowledge in a linear fashion. In science, broadly speaking, there is a trust that the successive layers of deposited information are solid, that they're dependable. The discipline, in its arcane specialisms, is traceable back and built upon a single initial how, intoned millennia ago. It is not necessary or possible to check all the decisions and discoveries in between. In architecture, this is not the case. While technical information advances and is refined, the essences of architecture, the how of the experiential qualities of architecture, do not appear to me as ones which are acquired didactically, but somehow must each be achieved as a personal discovery in each architect and with differing results. One way of expressing this is to view architecture education as having elements of that of a craft. Like a craft, there are formal exercises to be undertaken, core skills and competencies to be acquired, and standards to be met. But above all these, there is a value system to be adopted, one that edits the world and allows someone to operate with clarity. For many architects, the first steps towards this are the adoption through imitation of another's value system. The progression from imitation to nuanced independence, informed by the broader culture of architecture, is therefore a core process. One for me that in any case did not occur within the walls of a learned institution, but outside within my practice. The formation of and sustenance of this position must be one continually fed from within the practitioner. This aspect of architecture cannot be taught, but it can be learned, perhaps, if the environment is correct, by a sort of osmosis. Osmosis can only take place in an environment where the concentration outside the membrane is greater than that within, hence perhaps the value of schools of architecture, the library, the studio. Here, architecture is described and investigated through alibis, the drawing, the photograph, the text. There is a risk with this, in that these aspects can gain precedence. And I suppose what I'm saying here is that I wondered if we codify around the wrong thing. I wonder, did architecture codify about representation, the drawing, the text, rather than spatial experience? And I find it curious that today it's quite easy for people to talk about philosophical and linguistic processes and we're architects, and we find it very difficult to speak about spatial experience. And that to me kind of indicates a problem. And I suppose I'm not against writing per se. I mean, my students write in Queens too, but we should be wary of the written academic tradition which we're importing almost without critique from North America. So Fernando Tavera, the great Portuguese architect and educator, wrote elegantly about this in his journey from being a young architect, a follower of the texts and buildings of the modernist tradition, to the place-specific and careful work he executed in his country. He writes, quote, "The years rolled by. I saw buildings and I met architects. I understood that a building is not present in a beautiful plan or text or a fine photograph taken on a sunny day and from its best angle. I confirmed that after all the architects were people, with their greater and lesser qualities and with their greater and lesser defects. I came to believe that architecture is overall an event like so many others that fills our life, and like any other is subject to the contingencies that this life implies. And the untouchable white virgin has turned for me into a manifestation of life. Lost its sense of the abstract, I have found architecture like anything that I or any other person could create. Better or worse, terribly dependent, so tied to circumstance, like a tree through its roots holds onto the earth. So there's a problem for me in architecture to do with the gap between abstract reasoning and material presence. The issue is not one I stress of one versus the other, but one of balance. And I think that in exploring Shane's quote, I suppose it's not to devalue words altogether, but it's to put the work as primary and the words as secondary. It does not preclude words at all. I don't know, but perhaps in the past, previously these positions were less sustained by the individual, but rather by society, tradition and culture. But today, while today we may choose to align ourselves with these, it is a choice. Perhaps for the first time in a very long time, we find ourselves with no prevailing or even substantially competing orthodoxy to subscribe to. While we continually add to the continuum of thought that is the built environment, the culture of architecture depends on core principles being discovered anew in each architect and adapted to serve the societal and technological demands of the age. This position of the architect is one, of course, in constant development, but it exists at a field broader than an individual project or site. It is best described for me in what Caesar terms the difficult search for authenticity. It is the presence of this process that for me divides buildings from architecture. The profusion of pressures which can bear on an individual concludes this process. The process of engaging with these pressures is one which Frampton terms resistance. And for me it is interesting that while there is more text being written about architecture today than ever before, there is very little transformative criticism in this country or internationally. In the past, these voices outside the pressures of practice acted as a means by which these positions were informed and even galvanized. Resistance is easier when you don't realize it is happening, when it emerges from solidarity. Perhaps today this is more local and less celebrated. But I have to stress that I can only speak for a loose affiliation of architects with which I'm part, but we feel the absence of Shane's voice keenly, and we are searching for who the next Shane is, a champion. He mentioned Steve's, and I think a champion is useful, because in that reflection back you actually learn more about yourself. I have to say, I agree completely with what he said about the critic completing the project. I think that's extremely important and an often overlooked point for the practitioner, but also in terms of communication to the public. In all of this mess, I suppose it's time to talk about how we work, and more critically, for the purposes of today perhaps, to how we think. I operate in a partnership, a form of practice rare in other disciplines but common in architecture. Our practice is one that has over time stumbled into a clear work methodology based on modelling, drawing and sketching. Writing was not a core part of its concerns, nor is it a core part of the design process today. In talking about how we work with others, we have settled on the description of it being a sort of conversation. This bears some thought. For me, the sketch and the conversation are closely aligned. In a way, both can occur unthinkingly. We realise what it is we are about to say as the words leave our lips, and the same is possible with drawing. This intuitive and seeming unthinking relationship allows for discoveries and chance, which can be developed with rigorous testing through models, measured drawing, even prototypes. And I suppose we don't use the text then in relation to specific projects because we find it narrows the bounds too narrowly. Once we decide a building is a thing, like a word, like a pier or umbrella, it's very difficult to unremember those things. And so we rely on this, is that we insist that we cannot talk to each other about our projects unless we're actually drawing or showing the other person a model, that we cannot just have a conversation in the abstract. Frankly, we're too good at talking, too good at lying, too good at beguiling, all tricks well taught in schools of architecture, but very, very damaging within an architectural practice where you're trying to produce something together. This is a sketch that eventually led through a series of studies and models to a building that we've just got planning for. And I suppose what's excluded from this, of course, is all the cul-de-sacs and mistakes that are as part of that. And somehow for us, language and words and writing in that process isn't useful. And somehow out of all this work, a position has been established. It was something stumbled towards, I suppose. Intuition and judgment were our guides, recognised not in advance, but in a moment or with a backward-looking gaze. In our case, it's not something owned by either of us, but which is somehow suspended in the air between us. So why am I here talking about writing? I set out 18 months ago under the Kevin Kieran Award to produce a drawn manual of the technical construction methods found in the history of building on this island. I never intended to write. I had completed the surveying component of the work and was trying to work out how best to illustrate it. At the time, I thought that I might write something. I thought that this writing was a way of ordering the task to be undertaken, a way of describing what it is I was trying to do for myself, and perhaps for others if they asked. But once I began, it became increasingly valuable to me. There is something in the act of it, the structuring of it, which is inherently reflective. I realised, in short, that at this point in my career, it has become necessary for me to write, for it allows me to make discoveries about what I think. And I had not felt this before. It is this space for reflection that writing offers me, a space apart from practice. I remain wary of what value this might have to others. Those that have read my text have sometimes reacted with shock, misunderstanding my curiosity for certainty, my search for balance, for dogma. But I feel like I'm making some ground here, that there are elusive sensibilities that I'm trying to capture. Sometimes they prove to be merely patterns in the mist. Sometimes they prove more substantial and give more purchase. It is a private exchange between the page and the mind. For me, writing is making sense of things. It is a means to come to understand myself. And I suppose to illustrate that Donegal project, it's a simple house. It came out of a text I'd written in the Kevin Kieran Award called The Thickness of Paint. And it deals with the thickness of the line wash scrim in a tower house, and how that actually is what gives you the spatial experience of the tower house. And it was written as a kind of response to the Swiss architects who draw our tower house with the heavily post-shaped plans, and my point to them is that you'd only draw those plans if your own experience of the tower house was via ruins, and that if you experienced a tower house as space, you would not feel it as heavy, you would feel it as light. And out of this conversation came an observation about interiority and exteriority. So that project was not possible before I'd written something. And so, as most of us must do in our lives, I've proved myself to be a hypocrite. Those texts I read and misunderstood for certainty, I should have approached with curiosity. Is it possible to imagine it as ground, this material derived from the sedimentary action of layers of architectural thinking, the collective thinking of many generations? Carapaces grown from curiosity and inquiry, and over time bound into a coherent entity. We should mind this, I think, but I think we should add to it, even in a minor way, even if it is just with the equivalent of broken crockery or a letter rejecting writing. And so we return to Lochgar. And on examining the circle, it strikes me that perhaps I've been looking at it all wrong, all along. What I read as the interior of the circle was to those gathered there not the interior at all, rather it was the exterior of their world. Behind the stones, they were outside the places and routines of everyday life, although they were still visible beyond. So it is with reflective thought. It is a means of taking everything and somehow holding it at arm's length. Being outside, I can somehow make some sense from what I can see. Sometimes the best way to understand where you are is to make some ground and look at it. Thank you.
Writing also has this other realm that I suppose was best exemplified by Shane's presence here, where writing also becomes a means through which architecture becomes public, and that there's a necessity that architecture somehow ends up as a piece of text, because, or as words, because people communicate through words about things. So that there's this, but then once that starts to happen, that there's a slight ambivalence amongst architects about that step, or words being used, I suppose, about their own buildings or about architecture in general, and how other how words at that stage start to complicate architecture, and to some extent maybe take it beyond a realm that architects are comfortable with when they're talking or when they're thinking about architecture. And I suppose I just found that interesting, that seemed to kind of keep coming up, that writing is somehow seen as a link between the private and the public, and that at various points it becomes more complicated or something for architects to do. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that. It's more of a comment.
Well, it's about how they're wielded, I suppose, and it's kind of self-evident. A lot of this stuff is. Words are much more wieldable and directional than a building is. And to put it in short, my opinions about a building has never been changed if I experienced it first and read something later. It's only been maybe nuanced or enhanced, but never radically changed. My opinion about a building that I've read about and seen through representations has always been radically reinvented by the process of the experience of that building. And I suppose it poses the question as to what the collection of people involved in the field of architecture is seen as our role. Is it to produce these physical spaces for others, or is it to explore the thinking about that? Both are very necessary. I don't believe in binaries per se. And I think that in the context of that, I suppose, take a point, which is that I really enjoyed your presentation, Michael. But to take the Adolf Loos quote that you used, that quote, which says that you can write the parking lot, actually, if you look at the whole essay, it isn't really about that. And it's about how these buildings can't be photographed, and how they need to be experienced, and how the feeling of being in a place is radically different from being told about it through an image. And he was making a place of writing in that. And that's just an example. And so I suppose, I think as a practitioner, it's a long-winded answer, but it's a complicated question, is that writing has a critical value to architects. It really does, and it's enhanced the field greatly, and it's also damaged it greatly. And it's about how one has a nuanced position about that, I suppose. I'm intrigued by the two students who've asked the educators throughout if the students really did want to write, would you allow them not to? And a number of years ago, before I pitched the idea of the Career Award, I tried to do a PhD in several schools of architecture in Ireland, and ironically at the time, my proposition to them was to draw things that hadn't been drawn, because a lot of academics were writing about things that weren't drawing them. And universities couldn't see that standard of original knowledge in the form of 100,000 words of text, because their systems were set up for that, and they simply couldn't allow room for original knowledge in the form of a drawing. And so, I'm wary of rigidity in that context. I think that the room should be allowed for a student to go, you know what, I'm going to explore this way. It has the same value as text, and I will show that through these efforts in these ways. And I think that that's a very interesting question that they're asking.
Well, for me, it comes back to the core question of why we write, and perhaps it could be considered old-fashioned to think that the architect is the person who designs the building, and that's what the architect does. And perhaps, the field of architecture and the things that students of architecture can now, leave and go into the world and do is much broader than entering practice and design of buildings. So that's, possibly a really interesting thing that our architecture and education prepares us for a much more thoughtful, broader set of scenarios than just working with practice and design of buildings. I'm not sure if that's true, and I think the core of what we are the people who help society bring buildings into being. And so that to me is that. So then, if is the writing that happens, is that something that helps buildings come into being, or be more thoughtful or better? Is the architecture. But then, you say that, and then that's disavowing the kind of delight of just writing about something. And why, like the things that we do as an architect, like if you look at your life as a kind of creative person, whether you're an architect or a musician, or you're, it's a long-term formative piece. And if you're an architect and you go and read Heidegger for a year, you're going to start making different buildings than if you watch Coronation Street for a year, which might be equally valid, or certainly valid because it just influences the things that you do in a certain way. And so the experiences that we have, the time, the culture, at the time we go through college, at the moment, the culture seems to be that writing is an intrinsic part of architecture education. At my stage, it wasn't. So that's had an influence on me, just as the situation has had an influence on you. And what's most important isn't a dialectic of it, it's right or it's wrong. It's that architecture is a very broad field, and so there's so many ways to excel as an architect. And it would be a pity for education to remove that possibility from one set of people or another set of people. So that kind of sense of, it's a broad church, and
that's it. I mean, one of the interesting things we try, I suppose, I mean, and I think as educators, you try and learn from your experiences to what's been valuable to you. And one of the decisions we made in Queen's is that we wanted to know our students for 2 years, so we followed them for 2 years. And in that time, you set up a relationship outside of argument to do with your burgeoning knowledge of this person. And in a way, you can go to a student very directly, go, come on, you're not really about that, are you? And they know what you mean without you having to convince them with a very learned piece of spoken argument, which I would have used in other situations where my interaction with a student was that much shorter. And I suppose that's kind of part of that, I suppose. That's something that's probably likely, you know, we can't sustain that, frankly. It's incredibly tiring. Because like, what you basically try and do is you try and read every dissertation they write, you see every piece of work they do, and the two of us talk about all that stuff, and so as they progress their thesis, there's kind of an unsaid thing between the student and the two of us as to what they're about. It doesn't have to be articulated, but actually that's kind of wary. I can see why architecture is codified the way it is, you know, and I don't think it's invaluable. After all, the system, for all its flaws, has produced remarkable architects down the ages, and so therefore it has its value. I think that the interesting thing, I suppose, to talk about that in terms of the question, in terms of what it is that I was at a talk by John Banville recently, and he said he's fed up with people asking him what his books are about, because he generally answers that, it's about 250 pages. And I think I do try and avoid that question with my students. I don't try and talk about what the project is about. I try and talk about what it is. And I don't really believe in something without evidence. I think words are great, but they can stand in the stead of something, and I try to avoid that. I suppose that's how I deal with it.
Here, I guess we have architects talking to architects about the advancement of architecture, writing into architecture. But when we have two heads of fifth year, and Noel as well for introducing the theory in third year, when you stand before committees defending a tutor budget for HEC before academics, for want of a better word, how do you justify writing architecture?
I think the way that education happens within an environment or a field, and certainly at the level at which you're learning, an awful lot of the learning is done from one of you to another one of you, and it's an exchange between a whole series of peers, and that's much more precious than the kind of teaching that's done, with a teacher teaching a student. So that the maximum amount of effort needs to be put into making a creative environment in which students operate, and they negotiate their way through the various years within this environment of kind of thinking and making and questioning. So that in terms of making arguments as to where resources should be put, the resources should be put into the creation of that context. And I'd like to say, to add to that, that this afternoon and the afternoon that happened last week is that when it's really, to me, working brilliantly. That DIT didn't pay for this, but they facilitated it, and there's a huge amount of learning, exchanging of information. It's an amazing afternoon, as I'm sure last week was as well. And that's part of the creation of this world that you all exist in and we exist in. So to me, that's the duty of the educator, is to produce an environment, and within that environment, people find their own individual routes and ways through it.
I like your question, because that's the question as it should be phrased. Your curiosity as to how one could possibly convince an academic committee to fund theory and writing and architecture. I'm from a slightly different situation in that I'm not based within the Republic, so I'm privy to the UK system, if you is coming here, I would suspect, soon, because it started in the States and it's been adopted by the UK and it's not been criticised, and I'm just going to raise a few alarm bells. The easiest thing for me to ask for is more money to promote writing and to promote theory within architecture. And we've got a very fine cohort of theoretical thinkers within our school. The easiest thing for our school to do is to recruit people who only write. The hardest thing in the UK system is to recruit practitioners. That is almost impossible. And the reason for that is this thing to do with research. And so, essentially, research becomes the value of these learned institutions. Teaching is not quite the thing. I mean, I know that sitting there, that might be what we feel it's about. But unfortunately, there's a substantially different cohort in universities who believes that research drives funding and that funding therefore drives how we teach. And you will find, and they don't exist in Ireland, and you'll find academics in the UK system who will quite openly say to you, heck, I've got a class to give, I just wish I didn't teach. And they'll find ways to farm off their teaching to their PhD students. So it becomes a kind of a war of recruiting PhD students to do your teaching, therefore you can write more books, therefore your position you get closer to professorship, etc. And so I think we should be aware of this, because one of the interesting things about Ireland is that because that hasn't been so rigidly codified, we've produced an incredibly individual strain of academic who couldn't, I don't think, be possible to produce in the UK system. Like people like Hugh Campbell, like yourself, Gary Boyd, like Brian. Like actually, these people can read very broadly, and they don't have to justify themselves by constant publication, appearance in conferences, although they do that, but they can't be fired for it. I know people in Queen's right now who have been teaching there for 10 years, and they could be fired in the morning if they don't publish in what's called a 4-star journal in the next 3 months. And you can imagine that effect that it has on their students. They will start twisting their students' work to support their research. It starts changing things, so it doesn't become a free inquiry. And I would say that that's kind of a bleak picture I've painted. It doesn't happen in schools that are more self-confident, but in the peripheral schools in the UK it does. And I think that the issue really, I suppose, is how do we, and this is not an issue for you guys to address yet, happily, but how do we as a country understand that we need to support our research cohort, but how do we do that in a way which promotes and sustains a pretty unique culture, I think, in terms of how we teach and think about architecture, which is of value globally. But it isn't really being discussed, because actually it's a very hard thing to discuss. As soon as you produce a system, the system changes how everybody thinks. So one of the interesting things to show you the confusion that arises from this is we were talking about our studios to the Estates Committee, and there's no word in the university's lexicon for what a studio is. And we were explaining that we need 24-hour access, but we need to have first aid kits on the wall. Now that might seem self-evident to all of you guys, right? But if this says first aid kit on the wall, it's a laboratory, right? Laboratories have to be supervised, and they have to be open during teaching times only, because the lab is for formal, structured teaching. A laboratory can't be open with the students running it. So then we explained it as a workshop, and we found an even bigger problem, because workshops were places where you test things to destruction. And they looked at the bearing capacity of our slabs, they looked at the number of data points on the wall, they looked at the lighting levels on the floor, and they said it can't work as a workshop. So even the simple description of describing what a studio is, because we sit in this awkward place between humanities and sciences, it becomes like the letters I wrote about that. You know, you wouldn't believe it. So I think it's very interesting. I think that stuff, it actually being asked to find those incredibly simple things sharpens your thought to a certain extent, but at the same time it's very distracting. Yeah. I mean, another thing that comes up quite periodically, like, is the crit. You know, why do you have crits? Which we could go into forever. Which is fine within architecture. If you try justifying that to an engineer or to a doctor, it's become something. But you know, why? Why does Dominic's opinion and your opinion and somebody else's opinion? Why 3 opinions? Why not just Dominic's opinion? Is he not professional? Why can't you just Dominic doing all the crits one day and leave the next one? That becomes another thing. So this, I think that Dominic, you're actually making something out of the culture with these kind of events, which I think it'd be interesting to see how this generation of architects develops. They saw that the thesis symposium is kind of a self-confidence. It's quite different to how I expected it to be honest.
Any other questions? Nothing. It's a good point to end on. Congratulations. Yeah.
architecture was about, and I suppose a student's naivety. Because I originally asked Dominic and Andrew to talk about their writing in relation to their built work. I suppose we realised now that unless your buildings are literary narrative or Germanic, it's not really possible. I suppose in relation to what Marion and Anna were saying earlier on, how sometimes you don't always quote in your essays because often the idea is implicit, not explicit. I suppose that's the same for your built work even. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, all the speakers, everyone who came here today, Brian for chairing the event, and some of us will be going to the Black Sheep afterwards for a few drinks, so if you're free, come along. So thanks a lot.